All right, how's the mic? Can you guys hear me okay? All right, perfect. All right, so we're at time here, so let's go ahead and get kicked off. My name is Scott Sauber, and today I'm going to be talking to you about 10 things I do in every single .NET app that I make. I do have lots more than just 10 things in this talk. There's probably like 30 or so tips throughout this talk, but we'll kind of hit on 10 different bucket items. So I've already posted these slides up on my blog, just my first and last name, scottsauber.com. And if you want, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm Scott Sauber there as well. And I refuse to call it X. Like, that is just the dumbest name change I've ever heard of. So I'm just going to keep calling it Twitter and just be in denial about that. All right. So you are either here in person or watching on YouTube later. And so just to make sure you're in the right spot, I just want to talk about the audience that I had in mind when I built this talk. And really, I'm targeting .NET developers. So if you're not a .NET dev, there's still some stuff that cross-applies to pretty much any tech stack that you might be doing, but primarily I'm targeting .NET devs, and hopefully you are also interested in maintainable apps. So hopefully that like cross-section of like .NET devs and people who are interested in maintainable apps is kind of like more of a circle than a Venn diagram. Hopefully you're not a .NET dev that doesn't care about maintainability. Like, anybody in that boat here? Nobody wants to admit it. Cool. All right, so as I mentioned, we're going to talk about lots of different topics here, and really this talk is like a series of like 3 to 6 minute lightning talks. I'm not going to talk about all these different, or read off all these different topics to you. You can kind of take a glance at them, but there's also like a rapid fire bonus at the end where I'm just going to hit on a bunch of different topics and give you some quick tips along the way. So really my goals out of this talk for you are to give you some exposure to new ideas and then take some ideas back to work when you go back here at some point that you can go implement immediately. And I really like this quote. It's from Guillermo. I think his last name is pronounced Rauch. He's the creator of Vercel. He had this tweet a while back where he said, "Every system tends towards complexity, slowness, and difficulty, and staying simple, fast, and easy to use is a battle that must be fought every day." And I really like this quote. And it kind of reminds me of another quote that says, "Any idiot can build a bridge, but it takes an engineer to build a bridge that barely stands," right? So like, I'm not a construction engineer, but like if I just shove enough concrete into something, like I'll eventually make a bridge that probably works, right? But it takes an engineer to build a bridge that barely stands. And I think that's something that I'm really passionate about in software, is how do we build things that's just enough and we don't like over-engineer things in software. So who am I? I'm the Director of Engineering at Lean Techniques. We're a software consulting company primarily based in Iowa, which is kind of like the center of the US that you might fly over when you're going across the coast. But we've got people, roughly 150 people in 16 states in the US, and we work with like Fortune 100 companies down to startups and kind of everything in between. Help run the Iowa.NET user group, Microsoft MVP, friend of Redgate, and I blog as well. And again, you can get these slides up on my blog too. All right, so the first one we're going to hit on is folder structure. So how do we structure the code in our application? Well, by default, let's say you're doing, and this really applies to whatever you're doing, but let's say you're doing like server-side MVC, server-rendered HTML. By default, if you go like File New Project or .NET New and create a new project, you have all these folders created for you. Like, you've got controllers, you've got models, you've got views, you've got this www root folder with CSS and JavaScript in it. And the problem is, every time you need to add a new feature, you got to go spray different files across all these different folders. And this adds a lot of navigation friction, because if you're kind of just at a glance looking at, hey, what files are part of this feature, you end up having to go across to all these different folders. And if you have like a models folder or something like that, there's probably a lot of stuff in it. So it can be hard at a glance to see kind of what's going where. So you got this scattered feature across all these different folders. And if you ever have to add or update or delete a feature, you have to go touch all these different folders and make these changes. So a solution by this is to use feature folders instead. So instead you group by feature, not responsibility. So you might have like a customers folder or an orders folder or something like that instead of controllers, models, repositories, all of those kinds of things. And this promotes something called high cohesion, which is just a fancy word for saying, hey, these things are related and they should remain together. So by default, let's say you've got like a My Profile feature, and again, let's say you're doing server-rendered MVC. you have all these different files sprayed across your application just to add a new feature. And you can imagine as this gets bigger and bigger, this gets a little bit more untenable. Versus if you do feature folders, you can just do something like this, where you've just got a My Profile folder, and then you've got like your view, your CSS, JavaScript, view model, and controller right there. And actually do this in other stacks too. So I've done React off and on since like 2017. And I'll do something like this where I'll have like a My Profile component and then the test associated with it and like the SAS file. I'll have that all kind of co-located together. And then I've also been doing Blazor off and on as well. So if I have like an alert component, I might have the SAS file there. And let's say I've got like an alert type enum. Say like, hey, I want to pass like a danger or warning or error, whatever the alert type is. That model is specific to that component, so I'll just co-locate that right in the same folder as the component. Now, you have some of these people who will be like, but what about my layers? Like, I've got these horizontal layers, what do I do now? Well, I used to do horizontal CS projects. So I used to have like, the data project, the business project, services, repository common that you just shoved random stuff in. But now, for the most part, I just do two projects. I just have like a core project where most of the logic is, and then whatever the entry point is for my app. So it'll be like API or web or console. And then of course I'll have like test projects associated with those as well. But I'll also slice the folders vertically there too. So again, I'll have like My Profile or customers or orders or whatever inside of that core project and kind of put things that are related in there. Now, I will say, when I say all of this, I'm specifically targeting when you have like a project that's used just for a single application or a single API or whatever the case is. However, if you publish like internal NuGet packages or even on NuGet.org, it may make more sense to slice things horizontally and have like a models project or something in case somebody just wants the models for, let's say, getting your responses or things like that. So if you do have that situation, then it might make sense to slice horizontally, but I find most applications usually aren't in that situation. So a lot of times I'll just slice vertically. So I've got some resources here on this. I've got a blog post on how to do this, as well as that bottom link is to a YouTube video talking about vertical slice architecture. But I'll kind of leave you with this last analogy because I still have some people who are like, I don't know about this. Think about the soap in your house or your apartment or wherever you stay, right? Like, do you just have a closet full of all of your soap, like your bath soap, your dish soap, laundry soap, all of those kinds of things? No, right? Like, most of the time, your hand soap is by the sink, your bath soap is like in the shower, your laundry detergent's by the washing machine, things like that, right? So you keep things where they're most likely to be used. So if you think about that and apply that logic to your code, you should keep things that are related together and that you're going to use together in the same folder. So in case if you're still not convinced, or maybe you are convinced and you want to convince some people at work, that soap analogy I found is a good one to use. All right. Let's talk about treating warnings as errors. How many people have ever cracked open a solution that they've never seen before and built it and then saw like hundreds or even thousands of errors or warnings in the compiler output? Okay, like 15 people are brave enough to raise their hand. The rest of you are just flat out lying. That's cool. Because we've all done it, or I've seen this. And so I don't believe in warnings, build warnings at all. So I think it should either be an error in something that I fix, or something that I explicitly ignore and say, yes, I know that this is a warning, but I'm going to choose to opt out of this specific error. And so the way you do this is if you just crack open your CS proj and just treat warnings as errors true, that will treat all your warnings as errors. Now, I probably wouldn't flip this flag on for that project you crack open that has hundreds of errors, but maybe new stuff that you create, I would start doing this right here, which, as an aside, does anybody know why some of these say enable and some of these say true? That's always bothered me. Like, I don't know why some of these are enable and some of them are true. I can't wait for the next one to be like on or something like that. But yeah, go ahead and flip that treat warnings as errors to true and stop hating your life and other people's as well. Because I find even if you're like, oh no, I always clean up those warnings, like, you're going to miss one or somebody else will miss one, so just flip it on and don't have that happen again. All right, so next one we're going to talk about is logging best practices. And I have best practices in quotes because I kind of hate the term best practices. I more think of these as like, these are just my opinions as of right now, but it might change sometime in the future depending on the context. But we'll kind of, considering this is an opinions talk, I'll kind of give my general opinions on some of this stuff. First off, use Serilog as a logging framework. I've used nlog and log4net too, but Serilog is by far my favorite, so use Serilog. However, don't use Serilog directly. Like I still see some code bases that make this mistake where they're using Serilog directly, like the static log error and things like that. Instead, you can use the iLogger abstraction that's built into ASP.NET Core. So then you only have like 20 or so lines of code that's dependent on Serilog, not scattered throughout your whole application. Use structured logging too. So don't just like when you're doing like logger.log error, and then you might pass an account or something like that, or who the user is. If you do that in a structured way versus concatenation, then you can actually search for some of these things. However, just be warned, like if you're using Azure Log Analytics workspaces, those cap at 500 columns, and then they kind of shove all the rest of the data into an additional data column. So just something to be aware of that when you're doing this, especially like if you're serializing exceptions and things like that, I think that alone will take like 200 columns by itself. So something to be aware of, even if you're not using Azure and you're using other ones, a lot of them have limitations around that. As well as every log should have lots of key information on it. So some common things are like the user ID, a correlation ID, so you can track where a log went throughout an entire request, like the requesting URL, the app's version. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But with Serilog, you can just shove that stuff on a log context. So you kind of have it in one spot, and then all the other consuming logs downstream will get that. So you don't have to explicitly put that on each log. So if you're using Serilog, look into the log context, because that will allow you to add some of the stuff in a global fashion. All right, last thing with logging, before we kind of dive into kind of the differences between logging, metrics, and audits, is a lot of times when I'm in like a refinement session or something, and we're talking about a particular story, somebody might say, hey, we need to log that. And usually that's a pretty loaded statement. So I want to talk a little bit about logs versus metrics versus audits and some of the gotchas with each one of these. So when somebody's talking about logs, and I find people abuse this too, like these should be developer-focused things. Like these should not be things that you're exposing out to business people or anything like that. So some examples, like you're logging an exception, or like let's say you talk to an external API you don't control, you might want to log like the response code, things like that. But really, logs should be developer-focused things. These shouldn't be things that you're exposing to users or to business people on your side too. And I find a lot of people also abuse log levels. So I'm going to talk about like what you should be doing for different log levels too. So debug is supposed to be like tracing through like step by step. Like let's say you call like 3 external APIs. You might have like a log debug statement for each one of those 3 external APIs where you're logging out the status code, maybe the response body, things like that. But a lot of people choose to use information here when really information is supposed to be like a summary of debug logs. So let's say you call 3 external APIs to like create a new user, let's say. You should probably have a log information at the end that's like, hey, I created this user at this time, and then debug statements that are talking to each one of those APIs, or logging the responses of those APIs. But a lot of people just use information for everything, but really that's not really what information's originally intended to be used for. And the warning is kind of like, hey, by itself this isn't a problem, but if you see lots of these, this could be a problem. So like a classic example would be things like a user getting locked out of a system. Like somebody forgets their password all the time or whatever the case is. So them getting locked out once isn't a problem, but let's say they keep getting locked out every 5 minutes, and there's hundreds of those, that could be an indicator that something else is going on. Errors, I'm sure many of you know, is used for just logging, hey, an unhandled exception happened. And then critical or fatal basically means the app can't boot. So let's say you need to go talk to Azure Key Vault to go grab secrets to connect to a database or whatever the case is, and you can't talk to Azure Key Vault, well, then your app's probably not going to be able to boot. So that's an example of a critical or fatal log message. So again, you're probably using information, because I find a lot of applications are using information, but you probably meant to use debug. So you can totally, inside of your app settings files, you can say, hey, for my namespace, go ahead and log anything debug, and then everything else you might want to do like error, warning, or something like that. But really you have to ask yourself, like, how long does my log store keep logs? So again, when we're talking about like when somebody says, hey, we need to log that information, like let's say we need to log that, hey, this user made this change at this time, that's really not a good use case for most log systems because a lot of log systems might only keep the data for like 7 days or 30 days or a year, and you might need that information for longer periods of time. As well as Serolog under the hood, depending on the sync that you're using, might not guarantee delivery too. So when you call logger.log information, it's not going to go talk to Azure Log Analytics and come back. It's going to put that on a background thread and kind of flush that out on either a time cadence or after you get a certain amount of messages. So there's some issues with like you don't have some of these guarantees around your logs too. So that's why I also say that if you need things like audit records and things like that, logs is not the place to do that because there's not a guarantee that that will actually get delivered. All right, so quickly hit on metrics. So really there's two types. There's application level metrics like CPU, network, memory, like queue depth, response times, time to interactive, like all those like application-y type metrics. And then there's business type metrics where it's like, hey, how many times did somebody click that button? So again, you have to kind of ask yourself, like, how critical is this data? How long do I need to keep it around for? And does it have any guarantees that I might want on it? So like counting the number of payments or how many payments were made, you probably don't want to use something like App Insights to track some of that because again, you might not have guarantees that it matches what's in your real data store. So it may or may not be acceptable to miss out on some of that data. So again, you kind of have to think about like what data store are we using. And then finally, we've got audits. So this is like recording who did what and when in your application. So I come from like a HIPAA background where you're dealing with like health insurance and things like that. So we have to keep that information for like 7 years and say like, hey, Joe Bob viewed Susie's prescription information. So there's like a legal reason for some of that stuff. But you might not even have a legal reason. You just might have a traceability, like being able to trace who did what and when. And in this case, losing any data is unacceptable because like the HIPAA one that I just talked about, we would be legally liable if we couldn't prove who did what and when. So like that whole like, hey, I'm just going to shove it in a logger, like that might not actually end up in your log, aggregated log system. So losing data like that's unacceptable. So with this kind of thing, this is where you want to use some sort of atomic data store. Like if you're doing SQL Server, just have a SQL Server audit table or something like that, where you're storing it in the same store that's being audited. So you have it in a single transaction. You have guarantees that, hey, that data will end up there. So I just wanted to talk about like those differences between logs, metrics, and audits, because I find when somebody says, hey, we need to log that, they usually don't actually mean a log. They usually might mean like an audit. We need to have an audit table or things like that. So that can be kind of a loaded term when somebody says, hey, we need to log that. All right. Let's move on to the next tip. So this is using global authorized attribute using a fallback policy. So the problem you have by default, let's say you're creating like a new ASP.NET Core app with controllers, is you have to remember to add this authorized attribute everywhere. Or you have to remember to inherit, like let's say you've got some sort of base controller that's got the authorized attribute, you have to remember, hey, I need to go add this everywhere. And if you forget, or you don't have like an automated test that proves that all of those controllers do that, the downside is you're open up to the whole wide world, which is really bad news. So a solution to this is you can use a fallback policy. And a fallback policy is a policy that gets evaluated if no other policy is specified. So let's say you've got nothing on a controller or an action in particular, it will by default use this fallback policy. Now, if you say, hey, I've got this authorized attribute with this policy name, or I want to do allow anonymous, then this won't take effect at all. But by default, if you put nothing there, it will use this fallback policy. So the way to add that is just override the options for the add authorization call, and you can say, hey, I'm going to create a new policy. In this case, there's a few different ways to do it, but in this case, I'm just going to create a new policy builder and require an authenticated user and do a .build. But obviously, you could put more stuff in there, not just an authenticated user. You could say, hey, they need to have this permission or this role or whatever the case is. whatever makes sense for your particular system, or this claim, all those kinds of things. But I find a lot of people don't use fallback policies enough when they're a real savior for when you accidentally forget to add authorization to a particular endpoint. All right, next thing we're going to talk about is validation. So let's talk about validation here real quick. So problem is, we've out of the box with .NET, we've got these things called data annotations. But I find that they only really work well for simple scenarios. And anytime you need to make a custom one, things get a little bit more tricky, as well as they're hard to unit test as well. And let's say you've got lots of different validation requirements for a particular property. Your annotations can get tall, and you have like 4 or 5 annotations kind of stacked on top of each other. As well as if you're big into solid, you could argue that the single responsibility principle is violated because you have both your model and your validation combined into one class. So an alternative is to use Fluent validation. How many people are using Fluent validation here? Okay, like half the room, sweet. So Fluent validation has a Fluent interface where you can just kind of chain things on each other, as well as the business rules are really easy to read. So I've actually shown this to like a business person who didn't know anything about code and said, hey, here's all the validation rules we have for this particular situation. And they could actually read what was going on and understand, which is pretty cool. They're really easy to test. It integrates with model state. So if you're doing stuff with that currently, that'll integrate perfectly fine. As of a couple days ago, it had 372 million downloads. So it's used by a lot of people. And here's the GitHub link in case you're interested. So look at kind of what this looks like. So let's say you do like file new project and create a new user, like say, hey, I want to do individual authentication. By default, you'll get like this register view model, which says like, hey, the email is required, and it's got an email address, or it needs to be an email address. Password's required, and it's got a max length of this, and things like that. So all of those different pieces are different validation logic. So if you refactor that to Fluent validation, what that looks like is your register view model gets a lot thinner, and then you can inherit from this abstract validator of the type of the thing you're validating. So in this case, the register view model. And then you can create these different rules. So you can say like, hey, email's not empty, and here's the message I'm going to give it. And you can like localize all this stuff as well as set like, hey, anytime I use not empty, use this particular error message. You can do that in a global way too. But you can start chaining on these different rules. So it's really easy. Again, I literally gave this to a business person. They were able to read what was going on just fine. But you can also do a lot more advanced stuff with it as well. So in this case, this is pretty close to code that I've seen before, is in the US, you can't have a dependent on your health insurance once they get over 25. So you can do like a more complex thing saying like, hey, for the age, their age has to be less than 26 when they are dependent. So you're kind of chaining on like not only looking at the age property, but you're also looking at are they a dependent too? So you can do a lot more advanced things where we're reaching out to different parts of the actual model. So that is Fluent validation, which sounds like half the room or so is already using, which is awesome. All right, this is a pretty quick one. How many people know what the server header is in ASP.NET Core? Handful, maybe like 10 or so. So by default, ASP.NET Core will add a server header to your application. And this will just say Kestrel straight up. Does anybody know why they do this? Why do they add this server header that just says Kestrel? Yep, yeah, so Kestrel is the underlying HTTP server, but why would they put that header out there? There's not a good technical reason. It's purely for marketing reasons, so they can say like, oh, how many people are using ASP.NET Core, basically, or how many people are using Kestrel. Like, that's the reason why they do it. Problem is, to some bad actors, this exposes what you're running. So it is better than .NET Framework, where they'd actually say, like, here's the exact version of ASP.NET I'm running, so you could like target those specific vulnerabilities for that specific version. So it is better than that. But if some hacker's trying to get to your system and you're saying, hey, I'm running on Kestrel, Well, now they're like, well, I don't have to run any Java vulnerabilities anymore. I just have to focus on the ASP.NET Core ones. So it's kind of like security through obscurity in a way. So if you've got an issue, they're probably going to find it anyway, but it makes it a lot easier for them at the end of the day. So they can just focus on exploiting those known vulnerabilities that are out there. So it's really easy to add this. You just do builder web host use kestrel and say add server header false. So that's all you do in order to add, or to, sorry, remove the server header that gets added by default. Cool. So this next one is a little controversial, where I'm saying don't use I options, which is kind of a clickbaity title. I'll talk about that here in a little bit. But the problem with I options is it's pretty annoying to use, to be honest, because let's say you're using I options everywhere, is now if you have dependent CS projects, you got to add Microsoft extensions options as a dependency in some of your NuGet, in some of your CS projects, as well as if you're ever testing with I options, you have to do like options.create, which is kind of annoying to do. And I'm a big keyboard shortcut junkie, so like, I mean, we got primary constructors now, but I would typically do like CTOR tab and like have it create the constructor and then go to the constructor and type like I options, app settings, control dot and have it add the field. But really I don't want the field. I don't want the I options. I want the dot value. So then now I got to go like manually type this in and it's just really, really annoying to work with. So the issue, or so my solution to this is instead of registering or using I options, just register your options class directly. So you can still call the configure method like you're used to, but then in this case, I'm just adding a singleton saying like, hey, grab me the I options of app settings and register the dot value. So now when I need it everywhere, I just inject in the app settings. I don't actually inject in I options of app settings. You can also do this with like I options monitor and I options snapshot, which support like reloading settings on the fly. I typically don't use that because I'm not usually reaching out to like an app settings.json file on a production server and like live changing it because that's kind of dangerous. But you can technically do this as well. You just have to do add scoped and then do like I options snapshot in that case. So if you want to support that, you can still totally do that with this method. So I don't use I options directly, minus these 2 lines of code right here. So now I don't need like that NuGet package installed in all my CS projects, and now I don't have that friction when I'm trying to do keyboard shortcuts, because all I really care about is getting at that value. Is anybody doing this today? Something similar? Hey, couple? Okay, cool. All right, let's talk about creating a version endpoint. So what is a version endpoint? So you might think to yourself, oh, is this just like the version on versioning an API, right? Like putting v1 or v2 in the URL. And nope, that's not what I'm talking about when I say a version endpoint. What I'm talking about is what version of your app are you running? So usually I'll have like an API/version endpoint to have this, and I'll have a format that's similar to this where it's like, hey, the date that the build happened, the build number, and then the short git SHA. So I have 3 pieces of information of what version is actually deployed out here. And I generate that version in CI, and unfortunately, .NET versions do not support having that level of versioning. So I just store it in a file and then read it in through the endpoint and usually cache that as well. And part of the reason why I use a file is if I ever need to download the contents of it, I can go inspect and say like, hey, look at my version.txt file and say like, hey, what version was deployed out here. This is really useful when you're creating a CI/CD pipeline too, because I don't know about you, but every time I create a CI/CD pipeline, it's like red, 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 green, and then you're like, wait, but did it actually work? Like, do I actually trust this screen or not? And so if you have this version endpoint, you can have a little bit more confidence that like, hey, yes, this git SHA matches our latest commit, and so I know that the version that's deployed out there is the latest. What's also nice is, as I mentioned earlier, putting the version on every single log. So it's nice to be able to say, like, when you're looking at logs, saying, like, hey, what version did this come from? So let's say you do, like, a bug fix for something. You can kind of compare, like, okay, in the previous version, we had this error. Now let me search for this error in our latest version and see if any exist or not. So the version's also super useful to have on all of your different log statements that you've got. That's also why I recommend if you do put it into a file to cache it, because it will get read on every single log statement. So don't go read the file system every single time you're trying to send a log out. As a bonus, and I feel like this doesn't get talked about enough in the SPA development world, like a big problem that kind of gets hidden with SPAs is when you do a new deployment, and let's say you've got like some sort of breaking change, like existing users have already downloaded your application and are interacting with it and things like that. So like if let's say somebody hits a form and is typing things in, and now your API now requires another field, but they haven't been notified like, hey, this new field exists in your UI part of it, and they can't like literally complete the form. Now you've got this version endpoint, so you can kind of compare like, hey, what version do I have locally versus what version does the API support, and then notify saying like, hey, you got a new version out here. Do you want to click here to update and download the latest? So like there's also this use case for having a version that you're keeping track of in your application as well. All right, let's move on to code smells. So when we're talking about structuring a method, what I like to do is I like to always have the happy path of whatever happens when everything goes right at the bottom of a method. So I don't want to have to look like in the middle of the method of like, oh, what happens here? Do I save it to a database? Do I send an email? Do I publish a message to a queue? What happens when everything goes well? Like I always want the happy path to be on the bottom. So to achieve this, I use early returns instead of like nested if-else statements. We'll take a look at that here in a second. So by default, like when you create a new project, and again, this is like creating a new user, this is the default template code that gets scaffolded out for you. So if you look at the center here, this is actually the part where everything goes well. So if the result succeeded, then go ahead and log some information, generate an email confirmation, send an email, and then go ahead and sign them in. So it's kind of like in the middle of this method that's going on. And what's kind of funny too is whoever created this template put a comment here saying, if we got this far, something bad happened, basically. Which to me is an indicator, like if you have to put that comment, it's not super obvious that something bad happened if you reached the end of this method. So what I would do to refactor this is, first, I wouldn't have that if model state is valid check. I would invert the if and say, hey, if the model state's not valid, go ahead and return the page back out. Otherwise, try and go ahead and create them. And if that didn't succeed, go ahead and add those errors to model state, and then again, return the page. And then finally, there's your happy path at the bottom where, again, you're logging the person in, sending an email, creating a user, all of that kind of stuff. So that's like a super basic refactoring that I would do as part of refactoring this method. And I think it just leaves a lot cleaner code, and it also doesn't violate the indentation proclamation, which the indentation proclamation is the more indented your code is, the harder it is to read. So if you've got like nested ifs, nested for eaches, things like that, more than likely the code's a lot harder to follow, judging by how indented your code is. And if you Google this, I made this up, so this is not a thing that exists, but I think it's easy to remember the indentation proclamation. There's also like cyclomatic complexity and things like that that kind of measure the same things, but I think it's easy to think about like, oh, the more indented my code is, the harder it is to maintain. Now this does not mean like switch to like one space instead of 4 spaces. Don't do that, just to be clear. So some general code smells. These aren't hard and fast rules, just kind of like my warning light goes off if I see some of this. If I see methods that are greater than 20 lines, I kind of think about like, okay, can I refactor this a little bit? Or if I have classes that are greater than 200 lines, or heaven forbid if you use a region. I really think if you try and use a region, our friend Clippy should pop up and say like, hey, I see you're trying to use a region. Did you actually mean to add a new class or a new method instead? Because most of the time when I've seen regions used, they should have been creating a new method or a new class as well. So I'm not a big fan of regions. Sorry for anybody I offended. All right, so the next thing, got like 25 minutes or so here. Next thing I'm going to talk about real quick is HTTP security headers, which, by the way, I used ChatGPT 4 to generate this image, and you know, some of the words don't even make sense. It's like consultant security poly, and Then we've got like birds that are also like airplanes or something like that. So I feel pretty good about my job for at least a little while if this is what AI can do. But anyway, so HTTP security headers, what they are is they tell a browser what extra rules to enforce. So this can prevent all sorts of different types of attacks, like man-in-the-middle attacks, clickjacking attacks, cross-site scripting, and a bunch of other stuff as well. However, you need to be careful when doing HTTP security headers, because part of HTTP security headers is you can say like, hey, only allow content to be loaded from myself. So only allow myself to load Java, or only load JavaScript that comes from my URLs, right? And the problem with that is if you're wrong and you're actually really loading JavaScript from like Google Analytics or something, it's going to block those resources from getting loaded. So whenever you're doing HTTP security headers, you just kind of have to be careful to make sure you're actually allowing what you should, what your application actually does. So just kind of be careful about that as well. There's this package out there called NetEscapade's ASP.NET Core Security Headers. So it's written by Andrew Locke, which if you've done .NET development for any amount of time, you've probably read one of his blog posts. But he maintains this package here to help you add them. I do have a deep dive on this topic that I gave at NDC London in case you're interested. But HTTP security headers is something I do on every application. And honestly, if you're getting scanned by like third parties and things like that, they're going to check for this, as well as if you have to like pass third-party audits. Some third-party systems will require you to have security headers on your site because it's really easy to check whether or not your site has security headers. Which if it's public, you can go to securityheaders.com and plug in the URL, and it'll tell you, hey, you have these security headers or you're missing these and things like that. But if like this is a whole hour-long topic by itself, so if you're interested, you can check out that URL. All right. Next thing we're going to talk about is build once, deploy many times. So the problem when you don't do this is when you're building many times and deploying once, this encourages things like long-running branches. So if you have environment branches like a dev, test, production type branches, I disagree with that philosophy. I'm more of a only have one branch, like your main branch, and then deploy off of that branch. So this encourages something called trunk-based development. So even if you're using pull requests, if you're only using a single branch to deploy from, that's still considered trunk-based development in my view. And Atlassian actually calls Git flow a legacy workflow as well. So if you're trying to convince your team of doing some of this stuff, if you grab that link and send it to them, or if you Google like Atlassian Git flow, that'll show up for them as well. So by having a single main branch where basically you're going to have your CI build server and you're going to compile it once and then deploy those DLLs to each environment many times, this encourages continuous integration, which is more the practice than the server. So I'm a big fan of continuous integration. Is more of a philosophy than like a build server. Like yes, the build server is super important, but if you are like on your own world, on your own branch for like days or weeks or months at a time, you're not really doing continuous integration where you're continuously integrating your code with everybody else's code. So if you find yourself getting a lot of merge conflicts, basically every merge conflict is an indicator like, oops, I didn't integrate my code fast enough. So I think continuous integration is something you do, not something that you have. So it's more of a practice than anything else. And then you're going to have environmental differences, so like configuration or secrets, and those should live in the environment themselves. So again, if you have a single like main branch where you're deploying everything from, then you're not, you don't have like these differences where like, oh, you have to do some git foo where it's like, oh, I did a hotfix to like the main branch, so then I got to like backport it to the dev branch and the test branch and all sorts of other git shenanigans. Like if you're just doing trunk-based development, I find you don't actually need to know much Git at all. So that's another tip, is to build once and deploy many times. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is validate on build, which I don't see happen too often. So the reason behind validate on build is singletons can only depend on singletons, which makes sense if you think about it, because if a singleton depends on a scoped or a transient, it can't really be a singleton because you're depending on something that gets reconstructed. lots of different times. So this leads to what's called the captive dependency problem. So by default, if you accidentally have a singleton that depends on, let's say, like a DB context or something like that, ASP on core will catch this when you're running in development, but not other environments. So let's say you have a custom environment name called like local for your local development. Basically, you will never catch this problem until you might deploy to dev, and if your environment's development there, then you would catch this problem. So the way to fix this is, so again, the problem here is, let's say you have an add singleton with a singleton thing, an add scope to the scope thing, and then your singleton thing depends on the scoped thing. This is what's called a captive dependency problem, where basically that scope thing is effectively a singleton, which is not what you intended for it to be. And so you'll get this nice little error thing here that says like, hey, I tried to consume a scope service from a singleton, something bad happened. But again, this only gets checked when you're running in development. So to flip this on all the time for every environment, basically you just override the use default service provider and say, hey, validate on build true. Because ultimately at the end of the day, I never want to deploy this out to production. Like I understand why the .NET team did it, where they only enforced it in development because they thought of this after the fact and they didn't want to break existing applications. However, you might see weird behavior if your scoped or transient service never actually gets disposed of and recreated, right? So this will enforce it to happen in every environment. How many people were doing this today or knew that this option existed? I find this is a pretty obscure one. Okay, nobody, cool. All right, let's talk about automated tests here real quick. So hopefully this isn't a debate, but you should be writing automated tests. There's lots of different value adds from doing this. It's proven to be faster long-term with multiple studies. You can catch regression failures sooner, as well as if a test is hard to write, it might expose that your design is wrong as well. I don't really care what you use, whether it's XUnit or NUnit, just not MS Test, because ironically, like the .NET team doesn't even use MS Test. They use XUnit, which is kind of funny to me. But one problem I have with some of these testing frameworks is out of the box, the assertion libraries kind of annoy me, where you have like assert.equal and then it's like value. I'm like, I can't remember which is which. Now, XUnit does ship analyzers to help you remember that, hey, expected is the first one and actual is the second one. However, I find like sometimes I'll screw it up and like you have some funky assertion failures if you flip them too. So I like using Fluent assertions, which Dennis Doman, who created this, is I think giving a talk right now as well. But he's here, and so what that looks like is it adds a should extension method to object. So it'll just be result.should.be0 versus assert equals 0, result, which I think doesn't read as nice. Just curious, how many people are using Fluent assertions today? Or shouldly? Anybody using shouldly? Yep, shouldly is perfectly fine too. So I'd say probably like half the room or so. But Fluent assertions also has like the should be equivalent to, which does like a deep value comparison of different things. And you can actually compare like a customer object with like a customer DTO and kind of match up those things, which is pretty cool. As of a couple days ago, I had over 300 million downloads. So it's used by a lot of people. And again, if you guys are using shouldly, it's perfectly fine too. But to talk real quick about a tip when it comes to testing, I kind of want to go back to the 1800s and this guy named Anton Chekhov, who was a Russian playwright. And I swear I'll tie this back to testing here in a sec. But he had this quote where he said, remove everything that has no relevance to the story. So basically, if a rifle is hanging on a wall in act number 1, it should get fired in a later act. Otherwise, it shouldn't have been hanging on the wall in the first place. So really, everything should have a purpose at the end of the day, which, yeah, if you're a Game of Thrones fan, you know that doesn't always actually happen, where everything actually has a purpose. However, we can apply this to our testing as well. So if you look at this test here, this is a pretty simple one of, hey, just checking to make sure when last name's empty that we get back an error message. So really the only relevant part of this is the last name here, and everything else is just kind of extra fluff. And so a way to refactor this is you could say like, hey, I want to create a valid customer, like you have a factory or something. or private method, and then go ahead and tweak the last name to be empty. So there's a little less verbosity there. But you can go further. So this is usually what I do is I'll create like a field for this and have the customer get initialized to a valid value, and then I'm just tweaking that sad path afterwards. So again, you're kind of applying Chekhov's gun where everything should be relevant to the story at the end of the day. So every line of code should be relevant to your test. So if you find you've got a lot of setup, you might consider moving some of that setup up to the constructor, like your setup or before each or whatever the case is. So this concept applies to any tech stack. But you notice I'm also newing up a customer validator here. So like, let's say I've got some dependencies that end up here too. Now I have to fix all of these tests, and I'm repeating myself in each one of those tests as well. So usually I'll rip that out into the constructor as well and new that up in one spot as well. So if we look at kind of the comparison of the before and after, applying Chekhov's gun to testing, you notice like about half the lines of code are gone. So again, you should consider like, hey, is this actually relevant to the test I'm doing? So like, let's say you're setting up a mock or something like that, and you're setting up the exact same values in each one of your tests, shove that up to the constructor because it's actually not relevant to your particular situation. So again, when you're writing these tests, think of Chekhov's gun and think like, hey, is this actually relevant to this particular test? Because everything in your arrange step should be relevant to that particular test. All right, about 14 minutes left. We'll bang through some of these. How many people are using central package management today? Only a handful. That has been my experience as well. Not enough people know about this. So the problem that central package management solves is, let's say you've got the same package in multiple projects across your entire solution, where you've got like NDC framework in multiple spots, or let's say you've got like multiple test projects, so you've got XUnit in multiple spots, or NSubstitute, or MockQ, one of those. It's pretty annoying to keep some of these versions in sync, and especially when you're doing like a .NET upgrade, and you're like, oh, I need to move from version 7 to version 8 that we had to do recently, and now I got to go update these in all these different spots. It can be really annoying to keep those versions in sync, and like I mentioned earlier, especially test projects. But like I said too, I find most people I talk to, maybe like 1 out of 10, maybe, actually know that there's a solution to this problem called central package management. So this actually got added in .NET 6, so back in 2022. And basically what you do is you can create a directory.packages.props at the root and define all of your packages and all your versions there as well. You can technically not put it at the root. You can put it like lower too if you have like certain projects that you kind of want to group together. Basically it'll kind of traverse up your tree until it finds one of these and then use that one. So it'll just use one at the top. But I find most applications you just need one at the root. And then basically what this looks like is then you can just omit the version attribute in the package reference, which we'll take a look at a demo here in a sec. And then all packages will have to omit that version attribute. So you can't say, oh, I only want to manage this package using central package management. You kind of have to define all of them up front. You can technically override this and say version override attribute and say like, hey, nope, I know my central package management says it should be this version, but I want to override it and use this particular version. You can technically use a version override attribute to do that. So what that looks like is in your directory packages props, you have this property group thing and say, hey, I want to manage package version centrally, true. Again, we've got true back like we were talking about earlier. Some of these are enable, some of these are true. I have no clue why, but this one is true. And then you can say, hey, I've got an item group, and here's all the different packages I'm going to reference here. So I only have one with XUnit, but you can imagine you've got dozens of projects within here. And then in your CS projects, you just say package reference include XUnit, and you omit the version entirely, and it'll just implicitly use the one you've defined in your directory packages props. Again, you could put version override there and override that version if you so choose. Okay. Now we're kind of on to the bonus topics. So let's talk about some bonus tips here the last 10 minutes. So if you've ever wondered what SQL queries EF is making under the hood, it's pretty easy to find out. You can just switch the log level of Microsoft ND Framework Core database command to information, and boom, you will get that information. However, don't do this for any environment other than local, because in production you don't really need to see like all the SQL queries that are getting generated more than likely. Like you probably just need this for local dev. Like when you hit this endpoint, it returns this and kind of see what's being generated. So what that looks like, and it's kind of hard to see, but in your app settings JSON, you just do logging log level and say, hey, I'm targeting this particular namespace, ND framework core database command to information. And then down below here, you can see like there's like an insert statement and a select statement. You can actually see what SQL queries get generated. So if you ever have a slow running query or you're wondering what it gets generated under the hood, or a DBA is bothering you because they say, oh, EF can't be performant, you can literally flip this on and say, nope, here's my SQL query. What would you do different? And the answer is probably nothing in my experience. So that is logging out ND framework queries. So some more bonus tips. CI/CD pipelines, you should be doing them. If you're not doing them today, it's really usually not that hard to do, at least for sure the CI part of it, but you should be creating CI/CD pipelines, do automated builds and deployments. But something I don't see a lot of people do, so when people say CD, that's kind of a loaded term because it can mean continuous delivery, which means basically I click a button to deploy to production, or are you doing continuous deployment, which basically means as long as the build's green, it's going to deploy all the way to production. And so we try and promote continuous deployment as much as possible. And what I want you to think about, because I find 9 out of 10 companies aren't doing this, is think about how you get to confident green. And what I mean by confident green is when the build pipeline's green, why aren't you confident to deploy to production? And I find a lot of times it's like, oh, well, we've got this one thing I want to test manually, or whatever the case is. And you can kind of go through this loop of like, oh, I've got this one thing I want to test manually. It's like, cool, write an automated test for that. Now what's your reason for why you don't want to deploy to production? And kind of keep on that continuous loop. And usually the answer is write more tests to give you that confidence that everything works. Adding health checks, zero downtime deployments, all of that kind of stuff also feeds into a lot of this. But some people will be like, oh, what do I do though? Like you said use trunk-based development, but like how do I make sure these features that are kind of in flight don't show up for users? And the solution to that is using something called feature toggles, which is essentially just a fancy word for an if statement. So you can say like, hey, when I'm in production, go ahead and don't turn this feature on, or when I'm in a lower environment, turn this feature on, whatever the case is, or for this particular user, these particular groups of people. You can target all sorts of different things. And so if you're using feature toggles religiously and that's kind of baked into the mindset of your team, you can get some of these things where you're deploying continuously all the time. And actually have a family member who works at Amazon, and Amazon forces them to do continuous deployment. So if the build is green, it's going to prod. So it kind of forces you to write really good tests, and also usually forces you to have conversations with users sooner, both of which, in my opinion, are very good things. Also work in small batches, so try and figure out like, hey, can I split this up into multiple deliverables versus like showing up with a PR with like 200 files changed because nobody likes that. Again, you should be deploying frequently, ideally daily or even more frequently. And this might be controversial to some people, but let's say you've got a backend API, like a backend for front end scenario, where that API is specific to a particular front end. Don't split that into separate repos and have like a front end repo and then a back end repo, because oftentimes you like have to make changes to both and then you submit 2 PRs and you kind of like, all right, let's merge them, 1, 2, 3, let's merge them both at the same time. And you just run into this weird scenario. So instead, I'd rather have it in the same repo, have a single PR, kind of see everything at a glance, and then it can be part of the same pipeline as well. And also, if you got infrastructure as code, also don't put that in another repo unless you have infrastructure that's like shared, like networking or things like that. But if it's specific to your application, don't put it in another repo. Put it in the same repo for all the reasons I just mentioned. You can tie it to the same CI/CD pipeline and all of that kind of stuff. So some real benefits of doing some of these practices. One company we work with went from deploying to prod 12 times a year, and about half the time they rolled back those deployments to we started deploying over 2,000 times in a year, and we roll back less than 1% of those. And again, a lot of this comes down to having confidence, writing tests, CI/CD pipelines, health checks, all of that kind of stuff. As well as just writing maintainable code that's easy for people to extend. Because you can't deploy 2,000 times a year if you're dealing with a big legacy ball of mud, usually. And at the end of the day, the only reason why any of us in this room are employed is because we deliver value to users. So at the end of the day, this gets more faster value to users and more reliably, so we're not rolling back nearly as much. So with that, we got about 5 minutes for any questions. Again, I have posted these slides up on my blog, just scottsauber.com, and I left it intentionally detailed so you knew kind of the gist of what I was saying, in case, so you don't have to go rewatch the video. Yeah. Yep. Oh, okay. Good call. So it was more of a statement than a question. Is more why do some have true and some have enable? So the enable ones have more options than just an on-off default. Now that you say that, I do remember seeing that in some cases, but usually I'm just pure binary. But yeah, makes sense. Good call out. Any other questions? Yeah. Yep. So yeah, just repeat the question. Validate on build. Does that validate anything else? Just does the captive dependency problem. So making sure your singletons don't depend on scopes and transients. So it's kind of a bad name in my opinion, because you might think validate on build means like when you build your project, but it actually means when it builds like the IOC container basically. So yeah, it just validates that. Any other questions? What did people not agree with? Nobody wants to be brave. Yeah.
What tools do you suggest for the other two?
Yeah, so the question, I know we only got part of the question. The question was like, we talked about logs, metrics, audits. I talked about Serilog using for logs, but what do I use for metrics and audits? So the audits one, I use whatever database I'm using. So if it's Postgres or SQL Server, like I'll just use that particular database for those. For metrics, it's kind of a loaded question. So for like application style metrics, I'll lean on something like New Relic or Azure App Insights to give me like response times and CPU and memory and things like that. When it comes to actual like business metrics, usually I end up using the same data store that I'm using, so like SQL Server, Postgres, or whatever the case is. If I need to, like, if the metric is actually valuable to the business long term, and I need to like trend it over like a year or whatever the case is. So, another question? Yep. So yeah, the question was, do you put code in? Do you put code that says like, hey, save this metric? And yep, that's what I would do. Yeah.
Just building on what you said about auditing with SQL Server, are you talking about making bespoke tables, or are you talking about like
temporal tables?
Yes.
Yeah. I guess it kind of depends. So I know like EF fairly recently got support for temporal tables. You could write your own stuff too. I've traditionally used more audit bespoke tables. I've only used temporal tables once, but I mean, whatever gets the job done and the team agrees with is perfectly fine by me. Any other questions or disagreements? We haven't had disagreement yet. That kind of makes me sad. Yeah.
About the only having a single branch in Git. Like, I'm not going to argue with you, but that was the one that raised my eyebrows the most.
Yep. So that was more of a surprise than disagreement.
Argue with you?
Yep. Thanks for being brave. The sole brave one who's going to bring something up. It definitely is a big shift going from environment branches or Git flow to something else for sure. Even continuous deployment, when I first heard about it, I was like, how can this possibly work? How is this safe to do? And then once I started doing it, I found I didn't want to get rid of it too. So a tip too, when you're creating a new project, is like put that stuff in early. And I find you don't want to take it out later once you actually start getting users. Because honestly, what's the harm of going to prod when you don't have users? Probably very little. Just don't expose your database without an auth caveat. Yeah. And so the question was, why Serilog over nlog or log4net? To be honest, I just like the API a little bit better with Serilog. My experience with log4net hasn't been for a while, but I have memories of like changing XML files to do things. And I like Serilog. You can configure it through code. Log4net might be able to do that now. I know nlog can. I find the Serilog community is more vibrant too. So I know there's like, in nlog, I hit this at a client, they were using nlog, and they need to call a bespoke HTTP endpoint. And the HTTP target they were using was like an unmaintained package that was 2 years old that had like a socket exhaustion problem, the reason why HTTP Client Factory exists. And in Serilog, I haven't had that experience where it seems like a lot of the packages are maintained in the community around it. So and that could be because there's technically kind of a company around it as well, but that's one of the reasons why, one of a few reasons why I like Serilog. Go for it. Got a disagreement. Yep.
Authorized?
Yep.
Sorry. So, yeah, why add in a global fallback requiring an authorized user if allow anonymous is opt-in instead of implicit?
Are you talking for minimal APIs, or are you talking for
even MVC?
Okay.
For the last couple of releases of ASP.NET Core, you have to explicitly say that you want to allow anonymous on, say, a given action or controller. So, like, requiring authorization is
Implicit by default. Yeah.
Is implicit the whole way through. So, why have a global fallback?
I guess in that case, like let's say you have like a claim or a custom claim or something that you want to be enforced. That could be a reason, or a certain role or something like that. But yep, that could be a reason. All right, I know we're like 2 minutes over. So thanks everybody for coming. And again, if you want the slides, they're up on my blog. So thanks everybody.